So here we move in again to the second part of the dialogue, which really begins where I left off at the end of the last video with this remark by Sebes. Let's just call him. The Greek is probably more like Kebes or something like that, but Sebes, who asks or points out something which is quite legitimate. As I said in the last video, end of the last video, Socrates has simply assumed that given his definition of death, which is the separation of soul and body, or psyche and body, that philosophers should welcome that. Because then the soul is then freed from the body and has its chance to attain truth, really, for the first time. So the philosopher gets what they always wanted. But as Sebes points out, this is simply begging the question. And that question is, can the soul really survive that separation from the body? What evidence do we have that something like the soul, whatever you want to call it, that part of the self, which is apparently different from the body, which would be something like mind or intellect or soul or spirit or however one wants to put it, what evidence do we have that it actually can live, that go on to have an independent life? Which is a very, again, a legitimate question. And Socrates is perfectly willing to entertain it. As we see, his response to it is not hostile or dismissive, but he recognizes the substance of Sebes's questioning here. And so he realizes that he's got to come up with some arguments. That's what philosophy is at bottom, is the use of reason in inquiry and in support of certain hypotheses. And all we have here is a hypothesis, really, that if death is the separation of soul and body, that the soul goes on to live an independent existence, independent from body. He's got to provide arguments for that, and he begins to do so. And the first is the so-called argument from opposites, the idea that if everything comes from its opposite, which is seems like a rather arbitrary assumption, but on the hypothesis that all things are generated from their opposites, so that it's obvious that the dead are generated from the living. That is, let's just say that there are the dead and that they come from the living, that it would go the other way. That is, that the living would come from the dead. It is, on the face of it, a very bad argument, I would say. But there's no such thing as a really bad argument in Plato. That is, if one looks at it more closely, it's not so transparently false. The idea that, well, maybe things are generated from their opposites in some way. That is, each thing, or our conception of each thing, depends to some degree on its opposite, a contrast. So that if indeed we say that there are the dead and they come from the living, it's not so crazy to think that the living come from the dead. And this may be also enmeshed in some Greek ideas about the afterlife and about the fate of the soul and things like reincarnation and things like that. But that's just really a first stab at the thing, right? Because here at around 72D, we get another argument. Sebes says here, your favorite doctrine, Socrates, that knowledge is simply recollection, if true, also necessarily implies a previous time in which we learned that which we now recollect. If you read last week's reading, the Meno, you know that Socrates tells a kind of a story in response to Meno's paradox about the soul having existed forever and having learned all things, so that it doesn't have to learn anything new. It just it has to recollect that which it already knows. And this is a reference to that, because obviously the inference is, or the implication is, that if the soul existed before the body, then at least that would be some kind of proof that the soul can exist without the body, right? but it would be an existence of the soul independent of the body before birth. Whereas what we're interested here in is a proof that the soul exists independently of the body after death. But it certainly, if it were true that the soul existed before it was incarnated into a body, that would be some support for the idea that it could survive death. So they then, this is the so-called argument from recollection. Right? The idea that our knowledge, if we indeed have knowledge of things that we never learned in our lives, that this implicates, or this implies, a time before we were born, when the soul existed independently of the body. And this is the idea that we have a knowledge of what Plato calls the forms. And this is actually quite a central argument for Platonic philosophy. That is, he says, he starts talking about something like equality. We understand the notion of absolute equality, but we've never actually come upon two things that were absolutely equal in our actual experience. So the idea is that notion of equality, that notion of really mathematical equality or absolute equality, must be something that is an innate idea that must have been implanted in us in some way before birth. It's actually quite an important part of Plato in general. This idea that we have this inborn, innate knowledge of a whole host of different categories, as he says here at 75D, beauty, goodness, justice, holiness, that these so-called forms are pure ideas, or things that we actually know, we just need to recollect. But the notion that we already know them, again, implies that we must have learned them at a time previous to our birth. It is a certain argument for the notion that the soul at least it's possible for it to exist before birth. So it's possible for it to exist independently of body. So again, this lends credence to the idea that it could exist independently of body after death. So it's a rather long argument, but it has to be looked at closely. But that's the basic direction that it's going in. And then there's a kind of an interlude here, right? On that 78A here, where they just sort of talk a little bit. Siebes talks about Socrates being a kind of a charmer, and this may be another instance of a little flirting. But it's more just, this is a highly charged emotional atmosphere, obviously. These men love Socrates. He's not only their friend, but he's a very important person. He would not call himself a teacher, but they probably all regard him as a kind of a teacher. So he then returns to, let's see. Yeah, this argument here about the unseen and the unchanging, which I'll come to in the third video.